good afternoon and welcome to all the participants on day 3 of the International Workshop on Language Translation Skills. There's a very significant change in today's schedule as due to some unavoidable reasons, Mr. Ravi Kumar's lecture, which was earlier scheduled to be held tomorrow, has to be preponed and conducted today itself. Therefore, we have 3 technical sessions today. Let's begin with the first one and introduce the first speaker for the day, Dr. Umesh Kumar. He teaches at Department of English, Banaras Hindu University since 2015. Apart from teaching canonical courses in British literature, his research interests include Bhasha literatures, translation studies, children's literature, etc. He was British Council's Charles Wallace Visiting Professor at the University of Edinburgh, UK. In 2018, the prestigious NIDA School of Translation Studies, Italy, invited him to participate in its summer school as an associate fellow. So we welcome you, sir. Dr. Umesh, kindly take over for your technical session. So please unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself. Your device is muted. Yeah.
Hello. Am I audible now?
Yes, now.
Thank you. So let me begin by thanking the organizers for giving me this opportunity to speak on translation. Translation is some kind of an obsession for me for last 5 years or so. Before that, I was completely in oblivion about this field. But today, the lecture that I'm going to deliver would be some kind of an example of the journey that I have undertaken in translation studies, and so on and so forth. Before I begin my lecture, let me start with some kind of a thought exercise. I was going through the schedule of the lectures which have already been given and the lectures that would be forthcoming. I could see that all the participants are, in a way, being acquainted with 3 broader concepts. One is the idea of translation itself and how translation can be interpreted in different ways. And the emphasis has always been in our part of the world is with borrowing these concepts, especially in the sense of the institutional understanding. We borrow these ideas about translation, about the meaning of translation from the first world, from the Western world. But of late, there have been attempts where we are also trying to define what translation means to our part of the world, what it means to our epistemology, what it means to our ontology, and so on and so forth. So I will try to give some kind of a map of how do we understand translation in India and how it is to be understood when we talk about translation as a practice. Now, for all the participants, I just want to clarify about 3 broader distinctions that I make about translation studies as a practicing translator. So the first idea about translation is about translation history, and if we speak about how translation has been historicized in the West, you'll find that there have been numerous attempts in order to know what translation has done, especially in the first world. And you'll find that Bible translation basically makes the core of that understanding in the Western world. But in the Indian context, there has not been a proper attempt to actually come up to a consensus as to what do we mean when we are trying to think about a history of translation or translation studies in the Indian context. Of course, there have been some attempts, like one that was being done by the National Translation Mission when they brought out a book on translation and the history of translation studies in India. But apart from that, there has not been any attempt about how we can historicize translation practices in India. So the first is about translation history. The second is about translation thought, as to what those people who have been doing translation, what they used to think about the idea of translation. So, for example, when Sarla Das was trying to make an attempt to borrow freely from Mahabharata, what he used to think about this practice, what the same poets in Maharashtra or in Marathi were thinking when they were freely borrowing from Bhagavad Gita or Mahabharata. So there has not been any attempt as to define what was the translation thought of India. uh, Third point that I want to talk about is translation theory. So in that on that front also, we end up borrowing these translation theories from the West. And I was listening to some of these lectures. Uh, the point that I want to make is that quite often, even in the Indian context, we borrow from what the Western scholars have talked about translation and the theoretical understandings of translation. Of course, there have been some loose attempts to pinpoint about the possibility of an alternative theory of translation, uh, possibility of understanding an alternative cosmos of translation in the Indian context, but it has never been fully developed. So, for example, in Suzanne Basnet and Harish Trivedi book, Jane Devi makes an attempt to pinpoint, is there a possibility of Indian view of translation, where he tries to make some kind of a comparative understanding of the cosmology of the Western thought and also the Indian thought, where he finds that in the Indian thought there has not been very rigid sort of understanding about how translation is to be understood, where it is understood to be a very free flowing, creative kind of an enterprise. So I'm not going to talk about translation history. Of course, there has to be a lot of work that has to be done. I'm not going to talk about translation theory because some people have already talked about it. Some people are going to talk about it. I'm going to talk about a very important perspective, that is about the agent of translation, the person who does translate. In other ways, the practitioner or somebody who is engaged in translation. Now, there are two ways that I can do it. And of course, you know that in any discipline of research, one obsessive method of doing it is to do an objective analysis of the data that you can gather from some places, and then you try to analyze the data. So I have two sort of opportunities in front of me. One is about making an objective sort of understanding about the practice of translators in India, and the other one is about a subjective position. Now, I know that all of us in the contemporary research scenario are obsessed with objectivity, but the same kind of objectivity may not be possible when you talk about practitioners or translators, because I would say that it is some kind of an unorganized industry. So in India, for example, we have no data as to how many translators are engaged, how they are engaged from one language to the other. So we have no data whatsoever. So in that case, it becomes absolutely difficult for a person like me to actually speak objectively about translation practices in the contemporary India. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to exemplify with my own examples as to what kind of translations that I have done in last 5 years or five years or so, and what are the inferences that one can draw from my experience. Now, some of you who are listening to it could think that how dare I say that the experiences that have happened to me would also be applicable to you. So whatever be the limitations, I'm going to talk about the subjective experience of translating in the Indian context, and what are the uh, inferences that I have drawn being a practicing translator. Now, so this is the broader canvas that I'm going to cover today. So I'm going to talk about the practice of translators in India, as to how do they do translations and what are the methods through which one enters into the field of translation in India as a translator. But before that, I have to go back a little to give you some idea as to how the subjectivity of a translator is being historically understood. And most of you would agree with me that a translator is always seen with some kind of a suspicion. So much so that in the Latin sort of discourse, translators were also being called as traitors. Uh, so, uh, and the reason for this would be the historical subjugation of the very act of translation exercise itself. So you would agree with me, even if you are a beginner in translation or translation studies, that translation was always considered to be a secondary act. It was considered to be an act which was not original. It was, to a large extent, an imitation of the original, where the original was the self, and the translation was always considered to be the other of the original or the other of the self. So you'll find that translation activity always had a very substandard kind of a reputation. But we also have to understand that this, this copy or not being original within translation is also something that begins with the advent of the printing press. Because with the advent of the printing press, you also have this idea of the originality of the author. So authors could be termed as original, or the owners of a particular kind of work that is being produced. So with the advent of the printing press, the idea of the original starts to take shape. So the same kind of originality question gets into the identity of the translator as well. So one has to see that the translator was always under a suspicious lens. His activities or her activities uh, have always been understood as something which is not innocent. And this is also true in the post colonial sort of setup where translation is no longer considered to be an innocent act. For a long time, translation or the translator were always being put into the backyard. So much so that if you see the early translation works, you'll find that the name of the translator is not at all mentioned. Neither you will have the scope to say something about the work that you have translated. So it is only after the 1980s where within translation studies you have entered into some kind of a vague term called cultural turn, where the politics of translation becomes very important, and it is also to do something with the changes in the society at that particular time, where individual and the identity has become very political and very important. So from that particular movement onwards, you see that translators have started to gather some kind of a currency as individuals and as powerful agents of change, especially in the kind of work that they were engaged in. And of course, later on, you will see that so many reflections have come out. And now within translation studies, you have uh, a particular field of inquiry that deals with the sociology of translator. So now it is important as to who is translating. One is translating for whom, who is publishing, and so on and so forth. So now there is so much is at stake when a particular translator is engaged into translation activity. So the point that I wanted to make, and this is my first point, that the idea of a translator is highly political now. And we have to understand the idea of translator from that perspective, the subjectivity of translator from that perspective, that it is not an innocent act. So neither the translation is an innocent act, nor the subjectivity of translator is an innocent sort of subjectivity or identity. So translators have the ability to influence the text, and that's why you'll see that so many charges have been labeled against translators, where they are being considered as manipulators of the text, where they can create violence on the text, and of course they can also liberate the text. So you'll find that a plethora of ideas have started to get associated with the identity and the subjectivity of the translator. Now, I would rather qualify my title in that respect, that I should have said it as charting the translation practices in India. Because when I use the word charting, I actually keep it open ended. So, charting is like in front of me and in front of all of us, there's a big chart, and I'm going to throw certain dots on this chart. And then we'll try to see whether there can be a coherence as to what I'm trying to suggest about the practice of translation in India. So these are the some of these dots, and that's why when I'm throwing these dots, there may not be any particular chronology, but we'll see at the end of the day whether we can make some chronology or some kind of a narrative about it. And this is in tune with the modern practice of academic sort of enterprise, where slowly and gradually we are trying to move away from chronos and we are entering into the topos. So chrono refers to chronology and topo is basically the space. So for example, I see myself in a particular space and I'm trying to see whether I can say something about this discipline from the space that I'm inhabiting. So slowly and gradually, we are trying to enter from chronos to topos. And I'm not disregarding the idea of chronos. We have to eventually go back to chronology because not for something else, but because we are habituated to chronology and we are habituated to understand things in a particular chronology. So I'm actually speaking from a geographical position or from the position of a space which I'm holding at the moment and the kind of text that I have translated in last 5 years and how it has given me a certain kind of input which could also be admissible to any person who is attempting to enter into the field of translation as a practicing translator. Now, there are 3 or 4 points that I will make in order to bring home the point that I'm suggesting. And I will also try to show you some examples as to what I would argue in the course of another 40 minutes or so. So let me begin with the idea as to how I entered into the field of translation as a practicing translator. So it was in 2010, the master's degree was over, and I went to the English and Foreign Languages University at Hyderabad to do a PhD in the Department of Cultural Studies. Now, if you happen to see the kind of work that is being done in the Department of Cultural Studies there, you'll find that most of the work is being done where the idea of the text is being redefined. So it is not the sole manual text that all literary students like us are habitual of engaging themselves with. So there the text could be a phenomenon, the text could be a practice that you can read as a researcher. So there in the Department of Cultural Studies, I decided to work on a topic which was very close to my heart. And I relate myself with the state of Haryana. So I decided to work on a cultural practice called honor killings in Haryana. So when I decided to work on the phenomenon of honor killings, of course, I had to rely on text which were not manual text. So I had to rely on field data. I had to rely uh, on reports. I have to rely on incidents that have been reported in the police stations and so on and so forth. So most of the work that I have done there was a field-based study of the idea or the practice of honor killing. But at the fag end of that research, when I was about to submit, being a student of literature, I also thought that I must try to also get in some literary texts that talk about uh, the practice of honor killings in literature. And that was basically some kind of a triggering point for me to enter into translation as a practitioner, because I could get different kinds of text and I could get text in different languages which spoke about the practice of honor killing, and I could see that there was a large divide among the two languages, among the two categories of languages. So the large divide was that the texts that were the novels that were written on honor killing or on the theme of honor killing in English had certain kind of temperament, and the texts that were composed on the practice of honor killing in Indian languages had a different kind of temperament. And that was some kind of a triggering point for me in order to understand this whole politics that translation may involve for me in future. So, so the idea is that I was trying to show you some kind of uh, some PowerPoint presentations, but the host has disabled the uh, screen sharing thing. So, uh, so please switch it on so that I can show it to the students and the participants. Yeah. So there I could see the divide. The divide was that most of the text, most of the novels and the short stories which were written in English, I could see that the writers and the authors there were trying to cater to the needs of the English audience. They were not trying to cater to the needs of, say, for example, the Indian readers. So you will find that even about basic things, you will find a very strong sort of description about things that any common Indian would know, but they would try to describe everything, which was not the case with, say, writings which were written in the uh, Indian languages. And I'll give you some example. This was a plethora of texts which were available to us in the market in different languages, but I have only showed here primarily which were available to us in English and in Hindi. I'll show you something which is very interesting. If you could read it, uh, how the idea of honor killing is being represented in an English novel. So if you read, I have given you two kinds of, I've given you two texts which were available to us in English. And if you could see that, you will find that what they are trying to show. So what if this inner person inside her was to entirely take over Jugni and make her do stupid things and bring them all dishonor and shame? An image flashed through her mind. So if you see these red fonts that I have made, you will find that the English author is trying to report the event to an audience which is not Indian. So, for example, the kind of inner consciousness which is going inside the mind of the character. And for example, if on the right hand side, if you see the second paragraph, he's describing a particular caste. The Naus were a caste of barbers, though they were not untouchables. They were low down in the caste structure. The Constitution of the Republic of India may have denounced the caste system and declared the old custom of untouchability illegal. So, for example, for any common Indian reader, these are the things which are the information of common sense. So, you will find that when an English author is trying to write uh, on honor killing, his immediate audience is not the Indian readers, but he's trying to cater to an audience which is outside India. So these were some of the important things for me to pinpoint that uh, when we go into the when we go into say Indian writing, that is not the case. But when we go to the English writing, you will try to see that the English writers are trying to cater to an audience which is not Indian. For example, these are many descriptions where you will find that there is an absolute clarity that these people, these writers are trying to depict what India is to an outer world. But the same was not the case with, say, Indian writings which are available in Indian languages. This is an example that I'm trying to give it to you. This is actually a short story written by Ramnika Gupta in Hindi, which I've translated into English, and it has appeared in Indian literature published by Sahitya Akademi. Now, if you read this story, you'll find that it is absolutely different from the stories on honor killing which are available uh, in English language, because in English language we try to find that the writer is trying to walk with some kind of a censorship in the mind. But in the local Indian languages or in the Indian languages, you will try to see that these Indian writers are not trying to hold any words. So in these kind of materials, you will find that the abuses are written as they occur. The caste names are absolutely there. So one can see that the lack of Indian writing in English, the lack, I'm using the word lack in inverted commas, probably borrowing from the Western tradition, the lack of the Indian writing in English is constantly exposed by the writings which are done in Indian languages, say in Telugu, Hindi, or whatever Indian languages that you are part of. So I could see that Indian languages are far more free, they are far more spirited, and they are far more revolutionary and resistant as compared to the Indian writing that is done in English. So this was a major sort of uh, uh, problem that I inquired, and that's why I decided that Indian writing in Indian writings that are available to us in Indian languages could be a resource of a new kind of epistemology. They could be resource of new kind of knowledge that one can uh, take and show it to the contemporary epistemology. So when I related to, say, for example, the translations that I have done in the scope of or in the field of honor killing, these are some of the questions that were available to me as to why these translations that I am doing are important. Now, as a practicing translator, you must always grapple with this question that when you decide to translate something, why you are translating it? What are the reasons for you to translate? And there could be multiple reasons for translation. For example, some of us could be translating it purely for mercenary reasons. Some of us could be translating it purely for ideological reasons. Some of us could be translating it purely for pedagogical reasons because we want to make the classroom situation, the pedagogy much more interesting. So every person who decides to pick up a text, there could be a justification as to why somebody is trying to translate these texts. And I decided to translate these texts available in Indian languages, especially in Hindi, on honor killing, because I could see that I would be able to bring new registers to the English language. I could be able to bring new metaphors to the English audience, which are not available in the English writings on this particular problem. So I could see that I could enrich my data, I could enrich my reflections when I decided to translate these texts from, say, one Indian language, say from Hindi to English. Now, the same could be applicable to the other languages as well. And the point that one can draw from it that when we get into our own languages, we are able to see some kind of a new knowledge that exists there. And translation becomes the method, or translation becomes the bridge through which this new knowledge, which of course is hidden knowledge before you bring it into English. And why I call for English? Because English is so-called passport language of the world that we live in. So when you write something into English, you get some kind of an instant key to reach to a wider audience. And there are numerous examples where writers who have been historically at the backstage in the public life came to the front when they were translated into English. Now that is another problem that we have to encounter as practicing translators, because most of the translations that are happening in India right now, they are happening from Indian languages to English. So some scholars have termed it as some kind of a homographic translation, where translations are happening only one way. So that the translations are happening from Indian languages to English. It is not happening vice versa. It is not happening, say, for example, from English to Indian languages or across Indian languages. So if you see very clearly, if I belong to Hindi language, I have no idea whatsoever as to what kind of things that are available in Marathi or Nepali or Telugu or Tamil. So the point is that we are absolutely comparative illiterates about our own languages. And this is a major issue that we have to address as practicing translators. And this is what we try to do when For example, I translated a selection of short stories from Marathi children's literature into Hindi. So I have not done it in English. I thought that I will do it later. Because there has to be a communication among Indian languages as well. And this communication will not happen unless or until there is some kind of a negotiation or communication among Indian languages. And I think this kind of approach where most of these texts are being translated in English is some kind of a colonial hangover that is being carried on in our translation fraternity. And then if you see, for example, what are the basic requirements for translation, you'll find that one has to be at least equally proficient between two languages. And that gives the English departments in the country some kind of an undue advantage. Because if you make a thoughtful exercise, if you take out the titles which have come out, say, from Oxford or Orient Black Swan, or even from other reputed publishers, you'll find that most of these translators who have translated these texts from Indian languages to English inevitably belong to the English departments of some university or college. Now, this is again some kind of the hegemonic monopoly of English that one has to encounter as a practicing translator. So, when you try to translate from Indian languages to Indian languages, you are trying to create some kind of a resistance within the practicing translation field in India. Now, I'll give you some examples when I've said that the Indian languages are capable of entailing new knowledge for us. I would give some examples to you. Now, this is an example that I borrow from Shiv Murthy's Triya Charitra, which is actually a small novella, and I have read it as a text that speaks on honor killing and ijjat in the North Indian context. Now, if you see some of these observations, you will get to know what I'm trying to say. And these are also the challenges for us as translators. So if you read this statement, for example, I'm borrowing it from that text. It says, "Pardesi ka tarak bahut man bhaya hai." So you have this context where there is a character called Wimli, who is the protagonist of the novella, and she loves someone else, and this is a self-confessed lover who is talking to Wimli in this particular novella. So this is the conversation between Wimli, the protagonist, and her self-confessed lover. And now you see the interplay of language which is available, and how difficult or how challenging or how full of opportunity the Indian text could be for us as translators. It says, "परदेसी का टरक बहुत मन भाया है, जाति बिरादरी का एकदम ख्याल नहीं, ट्रैक्टर की ताकत टरक से बेसी होती है विमल, कहो तो कोनो दनी लड़ा के देखी लई." So basically, he's saying that actually this woman has soft feelings for a person who is a truck driver, and this particular self-confessed lover is actually a tractor driver. So you see how he's playing with the metaphors of truck and tractor in their conversation. So if you translate it as it is, it would actually give you a very ambiguous kind of a statement. And there are also a sub meaning or sub context to this dialogue as well, where the self-confessed lover is also reading tarak and tractor as metaphors of sexual organs. So he says that you have much liking for the truck, and you do not give a regard to the tractor. So he's basically also referring to the male sexual organ, and also the choice of Wimli, the protagonist. And so these are the challenges that one has to encounter. These are the challenges that I had to encounter when I was trying to translate these texts. And in that sense, it is not at all an easy sort of reading for anybody. Now, for example, in the next sentence, you see, बिल्लर कहता है विमली खान साहब के भट्टे की हेडलाइट है. So basically, Wimli works on a eat bhatta, and there are many men who work there, and she is actually an eye of attention for everyone. So you will see that the kind of interplay, how the language, there is no standard language in the most of these Indian writers. These writers disregard the idea of standard. So within one text, you have different kinds of languages trying to show us in the process that there is no standardization of language. Now, when we translate into a target language, for example, when we attempt to translate into English, for any English translation, we are always looking for a standardization of the language. So, how do we deal with these local registers? How do we deal with these interplay of words? Are basic problems when we get into translation. And I will also try to discuss at the end of my lecture as to what are the methods that I have used in order to encounter and address these problems. For example, now there is a description about how Wimley's mother basically keeps an eye on her youth. So रतौंधी होने से क्या हुआ, बुढ़िया विमली को मन की आंखों से देखती है, मन की आंखें बहुत तेज हैं बुढ़िया की, वह विमली के एक एक अंग के बाढ़ का हिसाब रखती है, पराया धन जब तक किसी की अमानत उसको सौंप न दी जाए. So you will find that the range of metaphors or the range of language is so powerful that you are always worried as a translator. So what are the methods through which one can translate these kind of texts? So no doubt these are the reservoirs of powerful new knowledge, but in order to bring these knowledges into mainstream, one has to be extremely careful. Now I'll discuss about this text that I and Pramod Padwal translated from Marathi children's literature into Hindi, something that I discussed some time back. Now here, the challenge for us was very different. Here the challenge was that the texts which are available to us for children are different from the texts that are available to us from the adult world. So here you have to clearly set down the limitations as a translator. You cannot go overboard with the kind of word power that you possess as a translator. So there, the method is to be absolutely iconic, absolutely faithful with the kind of source text that is available to us. And there are major challenges that one encounters when one tries to translate children's literature, in the sense that children's literature has always been on the margins. Within the margin studies, children's literature has always occupied the place of being at the marginal sort of space. And there was a major challenge to basically select the short stories that you want to select, because as a translator you do not want to select all the stories which are didactic in nature, which is the hallmark of children's literature. So I and Pramod were very careful when we were selecting the stories that we wanted to translate. So we didn't want to translate stories where in every story you'll find that in most of the children's stories there is a problem and then there is a final sort of arrival home kind of a resolution where everything gets solved. So we were deliberate that we were also trying to select stories which seemed to us as stories for children, but they were also comments on the adult world. And I have translated two such stories which have been published in translation today. One is Gachak Andhari and other one is Dinu's Bill. So you can actually log in and see the kind of method that I have used there. So the major challenges that you find when you translate children's literature is different from when you translate, say, for example, stories and novellas or novels on honor killing. So there has to be a continuous sort of adjustment that you have to make as a translator. And for every text, the method, the methodology, and the approach that you adopt is always different. So as a translator, one has to be very much improvising. And this was also some kind of an example of how collaborative translators work, or how collaborative translations has to be adopted, because this was the text that I did with Pramod. Now Pramod is actually the first speaker. I mean, Marathi is his mother language, But for me, Marathi is a language that I have acquired over the years. I have studied Marathi. I've been trying to acquire the language for last decade or so. But for Pramod, it came naturally as a mother language. For me, operating in Hindi was very nearer to operating in my own mother language. So you would see that we would sit as collaborators with the text, and what we did is that Pramod would read it in the original, and then we will have a discussion on the original, and then I will try to translate it in Hindi, where Pramod would read the Hindi again, because Pramod's Hindi is quite good. So he would read it in Hindi to actually judge it whether the Hindi version has come out comparatively in tune with the Marathi version. So collaborative translation practices are also very interesting, that one has to think as a method, because we are constantly trying to live in a world where we are trying to become more and more monolingual. So now with one language we can operate in the world. Or for example, you go to any part of the world, if you have a Google sort of app, you can just translate and so on and so forth. So slowly and gradually we are becoming monolingual, and if translation has to happen, it has to happen at least what Jacobson would say interlingual. So translation proper is interlingual among two languages. So one has to see that when one is trying to do collaborative translation, one could be extremely proficient in the source language, and the other could be extremely proficient in the target language. In that sense, the the final product that would come, that would be much more reliable, because there is constant auditing of the translation work that you are doing. Of course, there is other politics that is attached to it, as to who is publishing. For example, the kind of title that is visible to you is not the title that we have given. It is the title that was decided by the publisher. There are numerous sort of agents, or there are numerous sort of stakeholders that you will encounter when you enter into translation as a practicing translator. And I would also like to pinpoint that this is a thought exercise that all of us must do, as to what kind of place actual translations do have within translation studies or within the map of translation. Because there is an extreme obsession with theorizing translation histories, theorizing translation thoughts, theorizing translation practices, without giving a scope to, giving a space to actual translations. So, for example, in the Indian context, and this is a thought exercise that I have done, and you can also do it, you will make a list of the major journals which publish in translation studies. You will not find actual translations being published in those journals. So, you will have articles on translation, you will have book reviews of translated books, which of course is another sort of point of contention, that most of the translated books, they are reviewed from the perspective of their content, not from the perspective of the method of translation that is being adopted by the translators. So that is another problem that one has to address, that translation when translation is called to have a secondary position, there are numerous reasons for it. So when you read the literary histories of languages, you never find a mention of translation and translated books. So translation practices or translators have never been part of canon. Of course, now things are changing, where because of the arrival of the bodies like National Translation Mission, you will see that certain changes are being made. But historically and even now, those who practice, those who do translation, because some people would also tell you that translation is about doing, translation is not about theorizing. Theorizing would happen later, first one has to do translations. So as you enter into the field, you will inquire and you will get to know about all these problems that exist in the practice of translation, or as a potential translator. Sometimes you translate in order to give justice to a translation which is already available in the public domain, or sometimes you feel that an injustice has been done to a text. because in translation studies, the translation studies scholars would agree that there is no qualitative assessment of good translation or bad translation. Only assessment of translation is that if you are not satisfied with the translation, you come up with your own translation. So sometimes when you read a translation, you feel that this translation has not been done properly, and you come up with your own version of translation. So this is an example that you are watching on your screen. This is actually a short story of Premchand called Sawa Sir Gehu. And the first translation, according to me, of this story was published in the Penguin collection, which came not long ago. So what Penguin did, Penguin actually translated all the stories of Premchand, and they brought out his stories into 4 volumes. So when I got these 4 volumes, one day just by accident, this story got opened up called Sawa Ser Gehu. And when I read the translation, I felt that the translators have done major kind of injustice with the story. First of all, the title of the story was translated literally into English of what was there in Hindi, which I believe was a problem because Premchand was writing in a particular time period, and he was also writing under a lot of censorship. So one has to see that whatever title that he has given, uh, it actually doesn't sound well with the overall argument of the story. So, to cut a long story short, the story is about a young farmer who actually gets Sawa Se Gehu from a landlord, and he struggles all his life to pay it back. And then at the end of the story, you will find that he actually becomes a bonded labor, and after his death, his son becomes a bonded labor. So you will find that this was some kind of a bond of slavery, if you read the short story. And at the end of the story, Premchand himself says that, dear readers, please do not think it to be a story of imagination. This is actually a real story that is available around us, that is available around me, and that's why I have written it. So I would say that any translator has a baggage to actually compensate all these injustices that have happened uh, in the original. And that's why I changed the title. So I changed the title as The Bond of Slavery. It is not Sawa Ser Gehu. And I've also described as to why I've done that. And when I borrow this idea of slavery, I borrow it from Jyotiba Phule from Maharashtra, who actually wrote a book on slavery, which discussed about all these structural sort of um, entanglements into which the people in the margins get into. So this was some kind of a response to the story that was published in Penguin, and it was published in translation today. You can have a look at it as to what kind of method that I have used. I have used extensive footnote in the story, which has been done away in the Penguin translation. The translators are not at all bothered to describe any of these local terms and so on and so forth. So what we can call it as some kind of a thick translation. So it is not a thin translation, it is a thick translation where I am also getting into as some kind of a uh, getting into a defensive mechanism where I'm trying to defend the positions for which Premchand stood in his life, where he was trying to be a spokesperson for those people who were on the margin. So these are some of the challenges that you have to inquire. So this is a story that one would do purely for ideological reasons, purely for the reasons for which you make the meaning of your life, and so on and so forth. And there are numerous challenges that one can get. For example, currently I'm translating this short story by Mamta Kalia, and the name of this short story is Aapki Choti Ladki. Now you see what one has to do. For example, this Aapki Choti Ladki is this girl whose name is Tunya, and she's a girl who goes into 7th standard or 6th standard in the story. She comes down to fetch water from her 3rd floor or 4th floor apartment downstairs, and there is this servant of a doctor couple. The doctor couple is out and the servant is at home. And this servant, who is a grown up adult, uh, tries to take advantage of this young girl. uh, so if you read it, you see, दरवाजा खुला था, टुनिया सीधे अंदर पहुंच गई, नल खोलकर देखा, पानी नहीं था, फिर उसने हैंडपंप चलाया, वह भी सूखा पड़ा था, तभी राम जी रसोई में से निकल कर आया. राम जी इज द सर्वेंट. आज पानी नहीं है, सब खल्लास. टुनिया ने एक बार और नल खोलने के लिए हाथ बढ़ाया ही था कि राम जी ने अपने पजामे की ओर इशारा किया और अश्लील ढंग से मुस्कुरा कर कहा, लो इससे भर लो. Now, for example, lo isse bhar lo. Now, this is actually a story that can be prescribed for children. So, as a translator, one has to be extremely careful as to how we are rendering this into a different language. Now, for example, see the method that I have adopted. So when he's saying isse bharlo, he's actually referring to his penis. He's referring to his male sexual organ. So this is how I have done it. This is how I'm trying to grapple with this problem. So this is the working translation that is available on the right hand side. That day when Tunya reached downstairs with a small copper bucket, Jagtiani's back door was open. Tunya went in. She opened the tap. There was no water. She tried hand pump. It had dried up too. Meanwhile, Ramji emerged from the kitchen. There is no water today. All finished. Tunya had just stretched her hand once more towards the tap when Ramji gestured towards his trouser and said with a filthy smile, "Fill with this." I've kept the word "this" in italics because then it can actually pass off for the young readers, and it can also make statement for the adult readers. So these are some of these adjustments or improvisations that one has to make uh, in order to translate. And different translators have different opinions, and I'm thankful to the National Translation Mission that they have come up with a project called Translation Studies in Dialogues. So it is actually a project which is still under work, but this is an excellent project in the sense that it actually gives us a hope that we never get to know as to what translators go through when they translate a particular book. As I've already told you in the beginning that translators were never given credit. I mean, till 70s, you will find that translators were never given much credit. It is today that translators are being mentioned. They are available on the blurb of the book. They are available on the front page of the book and so on and so forth. So through translation studies in dialogues, National Translation Mission is trying to get into the minds of translators. So it is actually an ambitious project where some of us are engaged into interviewing the well-known translators of our country and what they used to think or what they think even today about the practice of translations that they have done. So this would help us to get into the mind of the practice of translation as to what are the methods which are being employed. Because if you pick up a translated text, you'll find that usually you will have a translator's note, but the scope that is given to the translator's note is very small. So a translator's note may not be more than 2 pages or 3 pages, where the translator hardly has a proper kind of a space where he or she can explain as to what has gone into translating this particular work. And as a translator, I think we should also think about the possible pitfalls that are waiting for us. For example, if you translate a text which was radical, if you translate a text which has historically been a point of contention, then one has to negotiate these problems. Now, I will talk about a very powerful story that I translated. I submitted it to a very well-known journal. And you know that in India, there are not many journals who actually accept translations. So apart from the translation today or in the literature or a couple of other private journals, you do not have much scope to publish. And if you are translating from one Indian language to the other Indian languages, the scope gets further marginalized. So if you translate from, say, Indian language to English, at least you have some chance of getting published somewhere. So I translated this very powerful story, and it had many caste specific names and characters, and it was a very volatile sort of short story. And it went through all the peer review. It was almost ready for the publication, but then I received this email, and deliberately I have decided not to reveal uh, the identity of the person who wrote this email to me. But the first paragraph, which I have darkened, basically discusses that the story is accepted and so on and so forth. But I have second thoughts about story now, reading newspaper accounts today of things happening to writers and editors involving alleged incidents of provoking communal discord, instigating enmity between communities, etc. Things happening over the last few months, and the controversial cases of involving intellectuals. I think it is better to avoid publishing potentially controversial material in so and so journal. Though I know the story is a masterpiece and accepted as such when it was published, things of late have become very complicated. Please think it over. If you could send me a story, and this should be in quote, if you could send me a story that does not name particular communities, I could consider that. It would be much better under the circumstances. So now these are heartbreaking sort of situations, that if you translate something that you are strongly you strongly believe in, because translation is also a possible method through which we can establish cultural dialogues. For example, if the Marathi short stories of the Dalit writers would not have been translated into English or other Indian languages, we would have never got to know as to what the Dalit writers had to say, or for example, the women writers have to say. So these are also the situations that one has to encounter as a practicing translator. And then, for example, this is a book that I have translated recently, and it is being published by Sahitya Akademi. In this book, if you will read it, you will find that this book is very simple, but then it is actually a book that plays on pun. So every line that you write, every line that you translate has two meanings. So one has to come out of one's skin in order to translate. And this is the point that I wanted to make, that it would be much more thinking exercise for all of us to decide as to how the subjectivity of the translator has to be understood. What are the methods that translators undertake, and how do they negotiate the work that they are trying to bring into from one language to the other? And so much of our work remains unrecognized. For example, this is what I was discussing with in fact, Tariq sir was discussing it with me some time back, that so much of translation that is happening remains in the unorganized sector. For example, on Netflix or on Amazon, we pick up any film and you will always have the subtitles. So translations are happening, but they are not in the organized sort of scope. So we have no idea whatsoever as to what kind of contribution that we are making to the economy, and how we can identify ourselves as potential translators. And I would say that there are different ways that you can identify. You can be a mercenary translator, where you will be translating absolutely for money. You would be a professional translator. You can be a translator who is a committed translator. So, for example, whatever translations I have done so far in my short career as a translator, I have always done committed translations. So I have not done translations for money, or I have not done translations just for the sake of doing translations. So if I translate something, I strongly stand for the work, I strongly stand for the writer or the content that is available in that particular work of art or work of literature, whatever you call. So I would say that uh, uh, to be a translator, as I've started in the beginning, is not an innocent act. It is actually a very political act, and one has to think it that way. So with this, I think I was given 1 hour. I should say thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Umesh. Today, you've put forth certain very brainstorming statements which need to be pondered over as a translator, as a practitioner of translation. So, there's a very valid statement made by you, which is that translation studies overweighs translation as a practice. So, which needs to be looked upon from the prism of hegemonic discourse, as you correlated translation, Indian translations with Orient Occident concept. So that hegemony, which Western hegemony, which um, basically rules the mental setups to kind of vanish the cultural disparity. And that is a very valid point highlighted by you. The cultural verbosity and blasphemy associated with a particular culture is very difficult to be understood, felt, and exhibited in a language which is completely alien, which does not feel like that particular language. Very valid points made by you. Now we have certain queries also, which I would want you to address. First is culture translatable? One of the participants wants to know, uh, as you very well hinted upon the uh, you know uh, translatability of the untranslatability of the culturally associated words. So, is there a provision where we can actually say that this particular translation clearly exhibits the original culture?
Mhm.
Is there a possibility?
See, as a practicing translator, I always believe that it is extremely difficult to translate a culture, but we should make an attempt to negotiate with the culture. So, negotiation with a particular culture is possible. Translation of a culture is not at all possible in the sense that every culture is unique in its own sense, and it is unique because it is not you cannot repeat it elsewhere. So the point is that as translators, one has to negotiate with the source text culture, for example, whatever culture that exists in the source text, and then make an attempt to find out nearby equivalents that may exist in our own target culture or the target text or the target language that we are trying to translate. Because my own experience is that not only cultures but even languages are extremely resistant for translation. Languages do not allow themselves to be translated that easily. So you have to encounter that resistance because one has to understand that languages are living artifacts. They actually define themselves by being different from the other languages, and sometimes the difference may not be that much cultural, but the difference is linguistic. So for example, if I'm a Hindi speaker and if I go to the south of India, I may not find much cultural difference, but there is an extreme sort of linguistic difference that I have to encounter. So I would say that with cultures, we must learn as practicing translators to negotiate rather than trying to translate the culture.
So the nearest approximation of that particular nearest approximation should be attained. That's what is your final take on this.
Yeah, because as translator, I think because translation as an activity is not a mere linguistic process. It is something else. I would say that a translator has to be extremely empathetic. A translator has to surrender himself to the text. A translator has to be in love with the text that one is translating. Otherwise, it is extremely difficult because you have to become part of that cosmos that you want to take or transfer to a different world altogether. So I would say that at every level, one has to negotiate before one is trying to, and negotiation is always sort of, a middle ground, isn't it? I mean,
So that brings us to a very pertinent question. Uh, is there any authority, like, can we actually take them as the translated texts can be taken as close to original? Can we term them as originals, or they are just fake, the way you described, that there is a lot of politicizing involved
Uh,
while translating?
actually,
So,
in that sense, we have to take resort to our own epistemology. We have to take resort in our own epistemology and thinking culture. Because if you think from the perspective of the West, they assumed it for a long time that translation is actually rewriting. In our epistemology, translation is new writing. So there's a difference between rewriting and new writing. So when you say new writing, for example, when Sarla Das was trying to adapt Mahabharata, or the saint points of Maharashtra were trying to adopt Bhagavad Gita or Chandi Purana, they were basically, for them, the source text was Sanskrit. But they were not saying that these were translations. They were trying to say that these are genuinely new original texts. Okay. So they were basically calling their text as new writings rather than calling them as rewriting. So I think we have to understand as to what kind of pedestal that we want ourselves to be on. So I would call them as new writings rather than calling them as rewriting.
So that means authenticity of the translated works is questionable.
Of course. I mean, of course.
Yeah. Should be scrutinized for that matter. Yes. That is what you meant.
Actually, the problem with the translation studies right now is that there is no auditing of the translation which are happening right now. So, for example, if I translate something, it remains translated and nobody writes a review of my translation from the perspective of a translator. So nobody actually, for example, the way we write reviews of the books, we do not see people writing reviews of the translations as acts or as activities. Yeah. So we have to go a long way in that sense.
Right. Thank you very much for these lucid explanations and everything which you did for us today. Thank you very much for describing obscure and baffling concepts like politicizing tactics involved in translation in a very, very illustrious and friendly manner. And I'm sure your lecture has undoubtedly uplifted the conscience, the moral level of practicing as well as the aspiring translators. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Umesh, for being with us.
Thank you so much.
Now let's move ahead towards the second session. The second speaker for the day is Ms. Tanvi Negi. She's been teaching in Department of Chinese Studies at Doon University as an assistant professor since a decade. She's an alumni of JNU. In 2008, she was awarded with one-year scholarship by MHRD to study at Southeast Normal University in Guangzhou, PRC. She's also translated Chinese novel from Chinese to Hindi. We welcome you, ma'am. Please take over for your session. Ma'am, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I started speaking before I unmuted myself. Thank you so much, Professor Ashu, for this introduction. A very good afternoon to all the participants of this international workshop on language translation skills. At the outset, let me express my deepest gratitude to the organizers for giving me this opportunity to share my ideas, my views, and my experience of first learning translation and language, then actually practicing it, teaching it in the university since I've been teaching here. What I like to believe and say is that I am a teacher and also a learner of Chinese language, literature, and culture. I call myself a learner because I believe that we learn as long as we live. There's a Chinese saying that goes, "Huo da lao, xue da lao," which means that we grow old and we learn. So as long as we live, we learn. That is the basic meaning of the of the saying, so I kind of follow that. So now that we have started with this with the session, and after following such an interesting session on translation, and the speaker before me so beautifully, I mean, I was very impressed, and I beautifully talked about translation, the politics behind it, and the importance of translation, and looking at translation as not rewriting but recreating. I mean, so it's very difficult to follow after that act, but I will try my best. So now that we are starting with this talk today, before I start, I feel like it's my duty to mention that to all the participants, that after the talk there'll be some questions, and because I'll be talking on Chinese translating Chinese, and so I'll be using some Chinese expressions. I'm talking about Chinese language and linguistic aspects that make it very challenging for Chinese language to be translated. So I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation for the benefit of all the participants here, since I'm assuming a lot of the participants are not conversant in Chinese language. I would like, so now I'll be sharing the PowerPoint presentation, and I hope that will be of some use to all of you. I'll be sharing my screen now. This is the PowerPoint presentation that I have prepared, and I hope it's visible. So now the topic of my talk today is translating Chinese, linguistic and cultural challenges. My talk today is mainly divided into three parts. The first part will deal with the overview of the history of translation studies in China. The second part will be linguistic and cultural challenges. And the third part would be translation in process and as a product. So I'll be taking examples from a translation, a practical the activity of translation. Now, when we look at the history of translation studies in China, we see that China is a 5,000-year-old civilization, and Chinese script itself is over 3,000-year-old, and it is one of the oldest written script, or perhaps the oldest written script to exist today, to continue to exist today in the entire world. And it is believed that the activity of translation in China began in as early as Zhou dynasty in 1100 BC. But translation took on an official, a proper form only after the Han dynasty, when the translation of Buddhism on Buddhist scriptures started. Like we say that we believe that in China, the first stage of translation started in Han dynasty, and with the dissemination of foreign ideas, mainly religious ideas, mainly Buddhism. Tao An, an imperial officer who was also in charge of a translation school, which was officially established by the court, advocated for strict literal translation of Buddhist sutras. And during this time, we see the very famous Indian monk Kumarajiva also enter the picture, the translation scene in China. And when he was invited to China, he carried out reforms in principles and methods of translation of the Buddhist sutras. And what he advocated was for accuracy of translation and preserving the essence of Buddhist doctrine. So what he essentially advocated for was a free translation instead of literal translation, because he believed that the what was important in translation was to keep the essence of Buddhist doctrine, the idea was more important. Now, when we see the translation, the translation of Buddhist scriptures, the first stage of translation in ancient China, it went on till Sui and Tang dynasty in 6th, 7th century BC, where we see the first peak of translation activities in China. Now, translation of Buddhist scriptures has over 2,000, approximately 2,000-year history in China. And it reached its peak in Tang dynasty, also probably because Tang dynasty is known for its grandeur and for promoting and for the flourishing of arts and literature in general, and also it's China forming diplomatic relations with the outside world, and so there was a lot of exchange of ideas and cultural and physical artifacts. So that also led to it made for a conducive environment for translation activities also to flourish. Now, the difference now was that initially the translation of Buddhist sutras, it began with Indian monks who were invited to China to bring with them the Buddhist doctrines, scriptures. But now it was Chinese monks who were trained in not only Sanskrit and Bhakt language, but also Buddhist doctrines. So after acquiring that knowledge, they came back to China, and then they carried out translation from Sanskrit to Chinese. Now, the main focus of these translators were to be faithful to the Buddhist doctrine, to be ready to benefit the readers, which is Buddhist believers, and to concentrate on the translation of the Buddhist doctrine rather than translating for fame. So we see here the focus was on why. So the question of why one needs to translate, why particularly some kind of texts are translated. So because and as we know that during this time, Buddhism, because of the fact that it was translated to such a large level, it actually could stand against the popular native religious schools around the time, Confucian and Taoism. So that was the kind of the power that Buddhism exerted over China and Chinese people, because it also was recognized by the court and by the king. And now, I mean, when we're talking about Tang Dynasty and translation during Tang Dynasty, then we cannot not mention the name of Xuanzang. Now we've all heard about Xuanzang, and Xuanzang, as we know, figure as the main protagonist in the ancient Chinese novel Journey to the West, that basically talks about how Xuanzang made this arduous journey to India, and he took back with him Buddhist scriptures, and then spent around 19 years in China translating all those Buddhist sutras. In fact, a lot of the translation, a lot of research that is done on Buddhism is done because of all the translated texts that are available in Chinese in China. And Xuanzang was not only just the practitioner, the organizer, and of translation of Buddhist scriptures in China, but he made significant contributions in promoting or in devising the theoretical foundation of translation as well. He said a translation must be both truthful and intelligible to the populace. So here we can see that he's trying to find the middle ground between literal and free translation, which is again was a significant contribution of Xuanzang. The second stage in translation activities in ancient China, which is during Yuan and Ming dynasty, is around 15th, 16th century, and it starts with the advent of Christian missionaries in China. And during this time, the translation basically focused on Christianity, science, and technology. So now the idea was basically to import the Western ideas, mainly the science and technological development of the West, and use them to develop the local, the native this thing. So the most of the translation during this time on let's say science, technology, hydrology, astronomy, medicine, mathematics, they not only served as a knowledge resource, but they also helped the Chinese scholars in furthering their own research. So they use these texts to further their own research. And a lot of these, and so these Chinese missionaries from all over the world, they were Portuguese, French, Swiss, Italian, and all of these missionaries, they worked in tandem with Chinese collaborators. And the main Chinese collaborators during this time some names are Xu Guanqi, Li Zhizao, and Li Tianjie. Now, Xu Guanqi plays a very important, particularly active part in introducing Western science into China. According to him, to excel the Western countries, we must learn and know things of and about the West. And to do so, we must translate works written by Western authors. And he became very popular for his translation of Euclid's Elements, which he did with Matteo Ricci, and also Claris's Geometria Practica by Li Zhizao. So these were two very important translations during this time, major works. Now, translations during this time, during Yuan and Ming dynasty, had mainly two distinguishing characteristics. The first was that unlike earlier period, like the first stage, the subject of the translation shifted from Buddhist scriptures to scientific and technological knowledge. The second was that translators during this time were not like earlier, they were Buddhist monks, they were monks, but now the translators of this period of time were mainly scientists and government officials who were themselves erudite scholars, and the Western missionaries who brought Western knowledge with them into China. Now, the effect of translations was that China was open to the Western knowledge, and translation facilitated the scientific and technical development. Now, the third stage in translation activities in ancient China comes in the 19th century, late 18th century, early 19th century, with the invasion of Western powers. As we know that Opium War 1940 changed the Chinese political system, and China became a semi-feudal and semi-imperial state. And during this time, because of this constant Western invasion and this humiliating defeat at the hands of these Western powers, they're not just one, but 5, 6 powers, Chinese intellectuals, they began to question their traditional culture and look towards the West for answers. So now they believe that the only way to rejuvenate their national spirit was by incorporating ideas from the West. And this is when the literary translation, this is the time when literary translation gains importance. And notable translators during this period include Lin Shu, Yan Fu, and Lu Xue. And Lin Shu, for example, he himself did not speak any foreign languages, but with the collaboration, he translated Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, and Cervantes' Don Quixote, Dickens' David Copperfield, and many others. So his contribution to the translation studies in China was great. Another translator and translation theorist who is very important and very significant is Yan Fu. So when he translated Huxley's The Evolutionary Ethics, that kind of made a huge, it created a huge uproar in China. It changed a lot of things. And he not only was he a very prolific translator and a very dedicated translator, but he also was made significant contribution in the area of translation theory, because he put forward his triple translation criteria of Shin, Ta, Ya. And Shin, which means Shin is faithfulness, Ta is fluency, and Ya is elegance. So what he believed is that the target text should be faithful to the original text. It should be fluent in the target language, target culture, and it should also be aesthetically pleasing. So his idea of this triple criteria of Shin, Ta, Ya was so important and so popular and so significant that it kind of guided the translation activities for the next 4 or 5 decades to come. Now we come to the modern China, this is 20th century. Now, for a lot of us, the May 4th movement in 1919. So I'm sorry, but for in China, May 4th movement, which was in 1919, was very important and a very important moment in the entire history of modern Chinese literature. It marked the beginning of modern Chinese literature, and that also it also marks the second peak in literary activities in China. After this time, and with the establishment of Communist Party of China in 1921, the translation of Marx and Lenin's work on socialism and communism also began, and a lot of Western literary works were translated on this time. So literary translation during this time had a significant contribution to the growth and development of Chinese literature. It is very important to note here that, that the translation of Western literary works had a major impact and actually changed, fundamentally modern Chinese literature. For example, the genre of novel, which had a very different kind of a form in ancient Chinese literature, changed totally because of the Western novels that were translated into Chinese. So the form novella that was basically taken from the West. Second, the language, the linguistic changes that happened also during this time was that the language in which literature was written earlier was classical Chinese, which only the scholars and intellectuals and the aristocracy could understand and could read. The common people did not have any access to this to the literary works around the time, And so the change from classical Chinese to vernacular Chinese actually marks a very important point in modern Chinese literature. And that also happens because of the translation that is done from the of the Western works, Western literary works to Chinese. And in translation theory, the main issues that were discussed during this time were like necessity of translation, translatability and untranslatability, the relation between translation and literary creation, which Lucian has discussed in detail, literal versus free translation, etc. Now, during this time, there were many literary theorists and many literary critics and writers also. But the name that stands out in modern Chinese literary theory is Lucian. Lucian is called the father of modern Chinese literature. He is perhaps the most important and popular writer in China. And he basically advocated for fidelity, loyalty, and faithfulness. What Lucian believed was that the act of translation was basically aimed at introducing different foreign ideas, and not just foreign ideas, but also foreign language into the source culture and source language. What he believed was that Chinese language could develop and could change, could grow with the influence of Western or let's say foreign languages, not just Western. So translations, not just from big, but also from very small countries as well, were done during this time. Lucian said a translation must have both intelligibility and the style of the original text. Another important literary theorist during this time is Xu Xiubai, who basically had shared the same idea than Lucian. And in fact, actually, from the conversations and between these two writers and literary theorists, one has translation theory in China took a lot of the inputs from the exchanges between these two writers. Now, in contemporary China, which begins with the establishment of PRC, People's Republic of China, the translation became important in the sense that the mainly translation activities were of Marx and Lenin's works, Russian works, and Mao's work, Mao Zedong, the Chairman Mao's works, from Chinese to foreign languages. Now, large quantity of scientific and technical works were also translated into Chinese during 1950s to meet the demands of the national social and economic reconstruction. Around this time, Fule, an important translator of this period, he advocated for the transfer of the original spirit in literary translation. So we see that there is some kind of contribution in literary theory as well. Now, the translation during this time, and also not just translation, but also literature during this time is very political. And also literature and of course with that translation was mainly used as a tool to serve the needs of the party generally, and the state and the people. Now, after 1978, so the translation and literary activities kind of came to a halt around late 1950s, 60s, because of many political campaigns and movements, and also Cultural Revolution, which lasted for 10 years. So only after the end of Cultural Revolution in 1976, literary activities and translation activities resumed. And with the reform and opening up policy, initiated by Deng Xiaoping during that time, it led to a rapid economic growth in China that also interpreters. And so many training institutes, courses in academic institutions, etc., were set up. Works on translation studies and translation theories in the West by the Western scholars were all translated into Chinese at a massive scale. So any Western theory on literary theory, translation theory that was published or that was there, exists in the West, has all been translated into Chinese. A very important translation theorist to be named here is Professor Chinti, who lectured on translation theory and practiced in Nankai University at the Foreign Language Institute of Tianjin for many years. He co-authored with Eugene Nida the popular book on translation, and introducing to the Chinese translation community his theory of dynamic equivalence with reference to English and Chinese. He said that the right combination of skill acquired through practice and a theory developed by the understanding of the task should lead to aesthetic results. So he is a very important name in translation theory in China, and it remains important even now. Now, we see Chinese translation theorists have based their understanding and their practice of Chinese of translation on all these theories, and they continue to develop with influence from the West. And we see that the translation as a practical exercise also and also as an academic discipline has gained a lot of importance in China, and that is very obvious from the fact that a lot of Chinese universities now not only have departments established catering to language teaching, but also masters and bachelor's courses in translation studies as well. And at a massive scale, translations are done from Chinese into other languages, and mainly from other languages into Chinese. The second part of my talk today will deal with linguistic and cultural challenges of translating Chinese. Now, as we know, the Chinese language is arguably the most difficult language in the world. Now, what makes Chinese language difficult and what are its specificities? So, because the language itself is difficult, and also because it belongs to Sino-Tibetan family, which is different from English, which belongs to Indo-European family, or Hindi, which belongs to Indo-Aryan language or family. So that also kind of makes it very difficult and makes it very different from English or Hindi, usually the languages that we translate into or translate from. Now, Chinese is a pictographic and an ideographic language. Now, what that means basically is that Chinese does not have alphabets. It has pictographs, it has pictures, so what we call characters. So each character depicts is a picture of an object, or it depicts an idea. Now, I've given some examples here for the so that it's easier to understand. The first character, if you look, it says R, sun. Now, if you see that this character and this character here, which is moon, initially when these characters itself are around 3,000, 3,500 years old. So initially when the first form of these characters was just pictures of, let's say, sun and moon. And then over a period of time, the language, the script developed, it changed. And this is the present form that the script has. So these are pictographs. Now, the next three words, E, R, san. Now, these are basically the numbers 1, 2, and 3. So if you see, one horizontal line means 1, two horizontal lines means 2, and three horizontal lines means 3. Now, if you see, these are ideographs. So a character represents an idea. Then we have characters which are formed with using a semantic part, a radical, and also a phonetic part. Now, if you see that the Chinese characters, they are so complex and so rich culturally, are culturally loaded, that they itself pose a challenge to the translator to first understand and then to translate. Now, when we see linguistic challenges that a language poses for translation, we basically have grammar and lexical and the words. So if we see the Chinese grammar, there are many specific characteristics of Chinese grammar that makes it very difficult to be translator to translate from Chinese to any other language and from any other language to Chinese. So first, for example, Chinese sentence structure is subject, verb, and object. Now, if you see that if you make a sentence, for example, 我学习汉语, then it literally translates as I study Chinese. Now it's correct, right? In English, you also form a sentence with subject, verb, object, and I study Chinese is correct. So if you translate from Chinese to English or English to Chinese, it will be fine. But in Chinese, modifiers are usually placed before verb, which is unlike English. So for example, if I add 我在杜恩大学学习汉语, that it will literally translate as I in Doon University study Chinese. Now that is incorrect in English, because in English, the modifiers are not placed before verb. So this is actually, a lot of students make this mistake because when they translate from English to Chinese. And that kind of, brings me to this very interesting idea that During one of the lectures that I attended, which was given by a professor in JNU English department, and he was talking about India as a multilingual and multicultural space, and he said that Indians are the translation is always in process, that we are always translating, and that kind of is very true, because what I've noticed is that what students do when they are translating, mainly when they are writing, even like for example, even forming a sentence in Chinese, what they do is in their mind they first translate from Hindi to English and then from English to Chinese. So it's very interesting that they never translate from Hindi to Chinese. They always translate from English to Chinese, and that is why they always make this mistake when they form the sentence that I study in Chinese in Doon University. Then the next is active and passive voice. So passive in English and Chinese have very different functions. English passive primarily function to mark a formal, objective, and impersonal style, and are thus pragmatically neutral, whereas Chinese passive are an inflective voice that tend to express a negative pragmatic meaning, evaluating the event being described as undesirable, unfavorable, or adversative. So, for example, 我被吓死了, I was scared to death. 被害, I was harmed or harmed. So it has a negative connotation, not always, but most of the time. Then the other point is that in Chinese grammar, subject can be dropped because of its connective function. So for example, if you have started a sentence with a subject, then in subsequent clauses, you don't need to repeat it. So for example, 我买了2支笔回家看，我都是用过了的. Now, that itself, if you translate literally, it means I bought 2 pens, returned home, saw, all were used. So you see, that war, that means I, is not repeated in the clauses. And we see that when you translate it literally, then it's wrong. So correct translation would be, I bought 2 pens. When I went back home, I found that they were used, all used. So I, the subject has to be repeated. Then power constructions, disposal power again is one of the most important, most widely used construction in Chinese. It is unique structure that has no equivalent, that probably has no equivalent in any other language, European languages, especially English or even Hindi. So it's used for to show a disposal or displacement or change in form of an object. Now, the problem is not when you're translating from Chinese to English, because then you can assess what is happening, and then you translate it in English or Hindi. The problem comes when you're translating from English to Chinese, and when you come to a situation where there's displacement, then you forget to use pa, because you don't know that if you don't know, then that is a mistake that you will make. You'll not be able to make a sentence in Chinese. Classifiers is very well known. Chinese is a classifier language, and classifiers are absolutely mandatory. And classifiers are nominal, verbal, and temporal, which are used respectively to quantify nominal activities and entities, verbal actions and time. So for example, any object that exists will have its own measure word. So for example, each towards 1 table. So if you want to quantify it, then you need to put a measure word. That does not exist in English or in Chinese. 一个女孩, so you have a measure word for everything. Even action, for example, if you want to say 走了一趟, walked, that also will have a classifier. Or if you're saying the frequency of showing frequency of an action, 看了2次, I saw it twice. So that you will also need to put the classifier. Now, the most important and perhaps the most interesting part of Chinese grammar is that it does not have tenses. So, which means that there are no verb conjugations, and therefore time words or aspectual particles are added to show when the action is taking place, or it is to be understood from the context. So I've taken an example. The first sentence is 我去图书馆. Now, if you translate it, it is I go to the library. Now, it can also mean I am going to the library, I will go to the library, I went to the library, I had gone to the library. So it can be used for all. I mean, it can mean all of these. Now, what happens is, for example, if you use an aspectual particle verb, like in the second sentence, it will become an act that has completed. That is an completed action. So it will mean I went to the library. Or in the next sentence, you use 过 as an aspectual particle, which means I've been to China. So it's about past perfect tense. Then if you use aspectual particle 呢, for example, in the last sentence, 我在看书呢, it would mean I'm reading a book. So it's present continuous tense. So you can see that there are no tenses. So the verbs do not change their form. Let's say to go will remain go. It will not change to went or will go or going. So that is a very important and a very is a point which has to be taken care of. So, for example, if you the whether when the action is happening has to be either if we use time words or, for example, we have to understand it from the context. The next punctuation mark again is a very important linguistic challenge that Chinese language poses basically for a translator, is because there are some punctuation marks that are very specific to Chinese language. For example, there's something called back comma. So in Chinese there are two commas. One is back comma and the other one is comma. So for example, if you look at a Chinese newspaper article or even political speeches, you'll find that sometimes an entire paragraph is just one sentence, has only one full stop. So it begins and then it ends with a full stop, and the entire paragraph is just one sentence. Now in English, sentences are not that long, but there are multiple commas. And in English, commas basically join two sentences, but in Chinese, a comma can also basically mean the end of an idea, the end of a sentence. So for example, and back comma is basically functions as comma in English. The second is that books, journals, articles, and names of titles are usually put not within inverted commas but within double brackets. Now that is again, if you're translating from English to Chinese and you put it in within inverted commas, then it's a wrong translation also, you see. The next is foreign personal names. Now, a lot of time, foreign personal names use dot between them. So, for example, Paul J could be written like Paulo and then dot and the Lekha. So that is something which is, not in Chinese or in Hindi. Then in Chinese sentences, the reason, the cause for an action is mentioned before, and then the result of consequences later. So, for example, in Chinese, when something happens, where it happens, why it happens, it comes before, and what happens comes later. That also poses a lot of a great challenge for translation, and especially when we are translating political, for example, news and everything. That makes it a little difficult for translator to translate if we do not understand it. Then lexical words are very important in the sense that in Chinese, Chinese language is a very rich language. The Chinese words are very culturally loaded. They have very strong cultural connotations. So there are some words here. The question of translatability and untranslatability come into picture, because there are some words, some concepts in Chinese that do not exist, or maybe that have a very different cultural connotation in Chinese than they do in English. There's a word called kang, which is basically bed, but it's different because it's in northern China, because it's so cold that there are brick beds, and under the brick beds there are furnaces to keep the bed warm. Now that is called kang. Now if you translate it as bistar or bed, the cultural connotation will be lost. So when we are translating them Chinese, then it's very important to keep in mind these cultural connotation. For example, idioms, another linguistic unit which is basically the most difficult part of any language to translate. It's again very important in Chinese, because Chinese people use Chinese idioms very often. Unlike in India, we don't use it very often, but in Chinese, even in political speeches, even in general conversations also, and especially of course in literature, a lot of idioms are used very often. So one needs to be very careful. Now, how we translate idioms is also very important. As Mona Baker said, that the main problems that idiomatic and fixed expressions pose in translation relate to two main areas: the ability to recognize and interpret an idiom correctly, and the difficulties involved in rendering the various aspects of meaning that an idiom or a fixed expression conveys into the target language. So it makes it very difficult for translation to take place. The two method that one can employ are domestication and foreignization. I've given some examples. I'll take a few. Let's say the second one is San Ren Cheng Hu. Now, if you literally translate this, it means the testimony of three men creates a tiger in the market. So San Ren, three men become a tiger. So if you say three men become tiger, then it is unintelligible in the target language. So it does not make any sense. What it means is repeated rumor becomes a fact. So a translator has to come to make a decision when if the translation of an idiom, literal translation of an idiom, becomes unintelligible, in the target language, then one has to counter and use the method of domestication. Again, a very this, for example, this sorry, for example, the one that we were talking about before here, Yi Jian Shuang Tiao. Now, Yi Jian Shuang Tiao is one arrow into golden eagles. Now, which in English, in popular English is kill two birds with one stone. But in Hindi, you have the exact equivalent, ek teer se do nishan. Chien is an arrow, so ek teer se do nishan. It's the exact translation. So sometimes what happens is that you can find the exact equivalent of an idiom in your culture, in your target language, and that always is the best case. For example, ching teer shruva, a frog at the bottom of a well. Like, in Hindi, we say Koop Manduk. So in Hindi, if you use Koop Manduk, you understand that it refers to a person with limited outlook and experience in life. So that helps if in target language you have an exact equivalent. Now the third part of my talk today will discuss literary translation as a process and as a product. So what I've done here is I've taken examples of a literary work of a modern Chinese novel, and the translation, the activity of translation. So here I've taken a literary text for study, which is a famous modern Chinese novel, Rickshaw Boy, Lotho Shanks, which is written by Lao She, and that I've translated from Chinese to Hindi. Now, the translation of this novel is part of a major project undertaking by Indian and Chinese government, where as part of cultural and people-to-people exchange and cooperation, translation of ancient, modern, contemporary work from Chinese to Hindi and from Hindi to Chinese is being carried out. And this is one example why translation is important, because it also helps in fostering better understanding between two cultures, two countries, and two people. As Goethe said, translation is one of the most important, valuable concerns in the whole of world affairs. And here the question of translation being cultural and political comes into picture. That translation itself is a political act, is a political phenomena. Now, the focus from linguistic model of translation to cultural model of translation is the result of the cultural turn in the postmodern world. Like Susan Bassnett, Lefebvre, Gensler, and Venuti are advocates of this cultural turn, and therefore they look at translation as not only to do with language but also to do with culture and language and text in a culture. So that the culture is embedded in the language and in the text. And like Susan Bassnett said, that the problem of decoding a text for a translator involves so much more than a language, despite the fact that the basis of any written text is language. So for example, this novel, Rickshaw Boy, it has been widely translated into many languages, including English and Hindi. It was translated into Hindi by a very famous Hindi translator of Hindi literature, Shri Raghuveer Sahai, and others too, and in Bengali by Ashok Guha, and all of these are available on Amazon. I mean, I have pictures that I can show you. So this one is in English by Howard Goldblatt, a very famous translator of Chinese literature, and this is Evan King, which is probably the first, and I mean the longest, the translation that stayed for the longest period of time. And then these are the Hindi and Bengali translations. And this is the translation that was done by me. Now, when one begins to translate, one is confronted with mainly two questions: why to translate and who to translate for. So, like Bassnett said, one crucial decision that a translator has to take is whether to bring the text from the past into the contemporary world, or whether to try and take the contemporary reader backwards in time. So, what is this novel? Because it was written in 1930s and depicts a China that was in complete chaos. And the protagonist is a proletariat member of society, and the struggles that he goes through. So it's a very political text, and it's very relevant. And so it was not so the text is not only important because it is very popular not only in China but all over the world, but also because because of its political relevance. Now, what I've done is I've used the translation by Shri Raghuveer Sahai and by me to analyze how the translation of the same source text can result in multiple target texts and how cultural and linguistic challenges are faced. So the first point that I will discuss here are the names of the main character. So so the main protagonist, Shangzi, remains the same. So I've used target text 1 for the translation by Shri Raghuveer Sahai and TT2, target text 2 with the translation by me. So the protagonist remains the same as Shangzi and Shangzi. The two female leads, Honyo is translated as Baghin because Hu is Bag. So her name has been translated as Baghin. And Xiao Fu is, for example, Fu means happiness and prosperity or something. So Anandi. So these two names have been translated, whereas I kept all the names. I've transliterated all the names, so the names remain the same. The second, for example, Chang, the place where where the protagonist he rents his rickshaw from because he's a rickshaw puller, where he rents it from, is called Ran Her Chang. Now, if you see, Ran is person, her is coming together or joining or something. Cha and is for the rickshaw, and Chang is, for example, the business basically, where rickshaws, not just one but many rickshaws are there, which are rented out. So Ran Her Chang, which is in English, has been translated by Harvard Goldblatt as Harmony Shed. And the target text one, it has been translated as Milap Ahata. And I have translated as Milan Rickshaw Kendra. So so the reason why I used it, because if you see Rickshaw Kendra becomes, it shows exactly what it basically is. And Milan, because it's basically the coming together of the man and the rickshaw, and the entire story is about the man's relationship with his rickshaw. Now, I've taken few examples of sentences, and I have written the English translation as well for the benefit of all the participants who probably would not be able to read the Chinese version. And I've used it so that we can compare how translation differs. Same source text can lead to different translations, and how sometimes some part is lost and some part is gained. So, for example, here Thapu Phatriku. Now, Triku basically means hard work, like that he is not scared of working hard, basically. But it was translated as Shang-Chi Sankato se nahi darta tha. So here there's a difference, the change in the meaning, where the meaning exactly is that Shang-Chi parishram se nahi ghabrata tha. And you see how this part of अपनी गलती माफ कर दी लेकिन उससे माफ कर तो कर दी लेकिन उससे सीखा नहीं, ये this part of has not been translated, so it's sort of paraphrased. Then the second sentence where I'd like to bring your attention to, what I would like to bring your attention to is the word shotwan. Now this actually means method, if you see, but here what it means is tricks. But even tricks does not exactly tell you the exact the idea, the connotation of the word. What the word here in the context, in the text, what means is the ways by which you get things done. Now in Hindi, what I feel is that the word jugaad is something in contemporary use, which kind of gives the same meaning. The last one is a little long. I hope you'll be able to find some time to read this. What I would like to bring your attention to is, in a very manner, is that how this the translation in the target text one, paraphrasing has been done. So a lot of the parts, for example, have been paraphrased and not been translated exactly. Whereas in target text two, you see a sort of a kind of tilt towards the original text, source text. So even the form of the way the sentences are formed in Hindi are different, because they are kind of influenced. The influence of the source text is very visible in the target text too. And that I feel it shows how a translator and a translation, the activity of translation cannot be done in isolation and in a vacuum. So a translation or a translator is always affected by external factors, whether one admits or not, or whether, I mean, because there's the concept, the idea of perfect translation, does not exist. I mean, it's a utopian dream. Even Professor Chinti talked about adequate translation, acceptable translation, and not perfect translations. This novel, when it was translated by Ivan King's English translation of this novel, the last chapter was deleted. And similarly, in the target text one, the last chapter and the most of the second last chapter has been deleted. It's not been translated, does not exist. What it results in, sorry, is that here the translator took the liberty to fundamentally, thematically, essentially change the ending of the novel. And doing so also change the ending of the protagonist. And because of that, this results in the change of the reader response to the target text. So it's very difficult to know that in the target text one, this translation law, sorry, or again, or difference, whether it is because it was the decision of the translator, or because it was a translation of a translation. So it was translated from English, so from Chinese to English, and then English to Hindi. So kind of the translation loss becomes more. With this, I come to the end of my talk today, and I hope that I'll have some time left, probably 10 minutes. I'm sorry I've taken a little longer, I would be very happy to take a few questions if you would like. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Negi, for providing a very comprehensive delineation of the history of translation in China with the help of a detailed and well-framed PPT. I must tell you, it was very impressive. I was going through the feedback, the comments in the comment of them. They found it very familiar and kind of found out the analogies which you wanted to highlight and the disparities which you wanted to highlight between translating languages which are completely not associated in any manner, like English and Chinese are completely different. There are many syntactical and grammatical differences which you very well highlighted. So one of the query which has been put forth by one of the participants is, do the Chinese translators follow some particular theories of translation of their own, or do they also follow the normal Western theories? Do they stick to Western theories, or they have their own infrastructure?
Thank you so much for the question. Well, Chinese translators have over the period of time taken lessons from the translation theories that were there in China itself, and also learned a lot from the Western theories as well. So there are a lot of discussions in the translation studies in China, and most of them, of course, relate to the Western translation theories, and whether it is about translation, pragmatic translation, or about all the postmodern and in the postmodern world, the cultural turn in the translation studies, and deconstruction, structuralism. All the translation theories were translated from English and from French, and all German and English and all languages to in Chinese, and they have made a significant influence. They have significant influence on Chinese literary theorists as well. So the new interest in translation theories in China is evident now more so than before, probably, because if you see the history of translation studies in China, the more focus was on actually the activity of translation rather than the theories. But now the focus on translation theories is
all right.
There,
all right, ma'am, since you are practicing translator of Chinese, so do you actually sabotage the grammatical constructions, the syntactical and lexical constructions of one particular language while translating it into the others? As you only highlighted the fact that the passive voice in English is not used in the similar manner while we are talking in Chinese or we are writing in Chinese. There, the usage of passive voice is very variant. It's different. So how do you justify? Do you sabotage the lexical construct, the syntactical construct, or the grammatical dictums, or do you just bring a harmony between both? How do you harmonize?
Well, when we are teaching translation, so the translation is so literary translation is actually, I would like to put it in a very different spectrum, because literary translation is totally different and then other translations. So what we basically carry out are political texts, and for example, texts related to tourism, or let's say business transactions. So now when we're looking at the translation of these technical texts or political texts, then the focus is on keeping the focus is on the target readership. So for example, if I'm translating a political speech, then I have to make sure that it is intelligible to the target readers, because then we have to be very careful that it is intelligible to the target reader. So there, of course, if not sabotage, but then probably the grammar, the grammatical structure, syntactic structure has to be compromised so that it is more palatable to the target reader. That way.
Comprehensible to
comprehensible, exactly, comprehensible to the target reader.
And the way you put forth the history of translation, and you highlighted the basic dictums which they used to follow from at the very onset, when it started in 3rd century with Han dynasty. Then the main focus of the translators was to be faithful to the Buddhists. So eventually Zindaya came in, and then faithfulness, fluency, and elegance overtook. So this brings me to Dr. Umesh's concept of politicizing of translation. So can we draw an analogy between both and see it in a way that it is actually making the translator is sort of voice or the mouthpiece of the politicians, of the dynasties ruling. So that ways it is also again the same. I guess.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I totally believe that translation is a political process, and there are a number of examples that I can give to prove, to actually to illustrate that point. I'm sorry, but because the translation at the very beginning was even translation in of, for example, of into English. It began with with missionaries, Christian missionaries. In China, it began with Christian missionaries. In India, it began with Christian missionaries.
Yeah.
So the idea, so basically that itself was a political, act. And for example, in Tang Dynasty, when Xuanzang was sent to India to bring back Buddhist scriptures and learn about Buddhism and bring back those texts and translate, that was all basically sanctioned by the court and by the king. So king himself was basically a follower of Buddhism. So that at such a large scale, translation activity could not have been made possible if it was not officially sanctioned and facilitated. So I totally believe that translation is actually a political process, and for example, the dissemination of foreign ideas, and which began with religious scriptures, I think that would find a common ground in, I think, most of the cultures, if we see.
What is to be allowed and what is to be deleted is also a very is a very critical question, which is decided by the authorities. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ms. Negi, for such an insightful and brain-stirring session. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Now let's move towards the 3rd session of the day. Let's have the resource person. I'm going to announce the resource person's name. Is Mr. Ravi Kumar, Assistant Professor and Head, Department of Japanese Studies, School of Languages, Doon University, Dehradun, Uttarakhand, and he's been teaching since past 8 years. He's presented papers in national and international conferences and translated many poems and short stories from Japanese into Hindi and English. You're welcome, sir. Please proceed with your technical session.
Yes, nuances of translating Japanese into Hindi and vice versa. Ma'am, first I would like to say that the Japanese language, as you know, it's a pictographic script. So we don't have alphabets. As we just listened, Miss Tanvi Negi, we are from the same university, and Japanese also it does not have the pictographic script. So in Japanese language we have 3 scripts. One is hiragana, second is katakana, and the third one is kanji. The kanji is taken from the China, and the Japanese people, they have invented 2 more scripts. One is the hiragana and one is the katakana. Hiragana is the native and the katakana is for the foreign language. So if you see the structure of the Japanese language and the Hindi, it's totally different. But what happens when we translate is, if you see the structure of the sentence, Japanese language follows the SOV pattern. It's a subject, object, verb. Similarly, in Hindi also we have the same structure. It's a subject, then object, and then the verb it comes. So, but what happens when we translate from one language to another? If you see in the Japanese language, there are some words which has the same pronunciation, but the meaning is different. For example, if you see, I give you one example, that is hana. Hana has two meanings. One is nose and one is flower. But how the translator will know that which meaning has to be applied? If the kanji character is not available there, then it is very difficult to make sure that which word has to be replaced with during the translation. Similarly, if I give you one more word like kirei, kirei is a Japanese word which has two meanings. One is the clean, and the second meaning is beautiful. Now, when you are translating this word kirei, so what happens is, if you don't have the context, if a single sentence is written there, then there lies ambiguity, that which word has to be taken care while translating, which word has to be replaced while putting into the another language. So we see these kind of differences are there when translating Japanese into Hindi, or vice versa, Hindi into Japanese. Now, what I'm going to do here in today's lecture is that I'll discuss the challenges and the difficulties, and how we do during the what we do during the translation. I'll discuss at four levels. One is at the semantic level, second is at the syntax level, third one is context, and the fourth one is cultural level. So I'll start with the first one. It says the semantic level. Now I'll give you one example. There is a word in Japanese which says koto. Koto, now it has two meanings. I'll give you one example. Koto to nekutai o kata. Now, if you see the word here, koto, it has two meanings. One is the court, like we have the Supreme Court or the High Court. And the second one is the coat, to wear. Now, the word koto, which has been put here in the Japanese language in the katakana, it has two meanings. Now, if you just translate it, both possibilities lies here. While translating, both are the possibilities. But again, as I told you, at the semantic level, there has to be a database where we are very much sure that which word will be used and in which context. Now, I give you the second example at the semantic level, where lies the differences. For example, the second example is boru ni mizu o ireru. So boru here has two meanings. One is the ball, like the rice ball which we have, and the second one is the ball. Same word in Japanese language, but two different meanings. And second one is the ball, like the ball which we plays, cricket ball or basketball or any ball. Now, if you see the sentence here, if you just translate boru, it will has two meanings again, even at the semantic level. But if you look at the word boru ni mizu o ireru, so boru here, mizu is water, and ireru is to put in. So of course here it will be bowl, the rice bowl or any particular bowl where you put the water, where you insert water. So these kind of challenges, even at the beginners level, when we teach students in the BA first year, in the BA second year, so at the beginner level, students feel difficulty, while translating it, that which word has to be replaced. In Dune University, because after doing the graduation, this 3 years graduation degree, honors degree, a student are supposed to translate texts. It can be of any type. It can be of literary text. It can be patent translation, medical translation, or for example, in the automobile sector, you can have that automobile sectors translation related to those fields. So if a student is not clear, if the student is not sure about the target language and the text and the source language, then they're going to be lots of difficulty, lots of problem, because of these nuances, how these nuances changes. There are ambiguities while translating it. And now I'll give you another example, the second one at the syntax level. Now, I'll give it here Mr. Yamada and Mr. Tanaka and mother. So there lies the mean changes in the nuances. It can be translated as Mr. Yamada and mother of Mr. Tanaka. Now, second possibility is that it can also be translated as Mr. Yamada and Mr. Tanaka and their mother. So both possibilities arises here. So even at the beginner level, when we are teaching translation in the classroom, we make sure that the students are very, while translating, they are very much careful about these little bit things, that how they are translating and where the nuances are going. Now, if I talk about the context level, if you see the translation at the context level, what happens is, I'll give you another word that it comes in the literary text of Yodaka no Hoshi. It was written by a very famous writer, Japanese writer. It's Miyazawa Kenji, and he has written a very famous short story, and it's about Yodaka no Hoshi. So there is a word, that Yodaka wa mi nikui tori desu. Now this is a sentence in his text. Yodaka is a hawk, and mi nikui means, again, it has two meanings. If you see the kanji characters in the Japanese, it will give you two meanings. One is that rare, and the second meaning is ugly. And then the sentence goes further. It says, Yodaka wa mi nikui tori. Tori is a bird. So if you translate this simple sentence, it says that hawk is a rare bird. Now, second possibility is hawk is an ugly bird. Now, both sentences are grammatically correct. If you use rare also, it is grammatically okay. And even if you use ugly, the sentence is perfectly okay. But what happens is, if you go further, if you read the further sentences, then you will really come to know that, because if you argue the whole story, that how this translation goes on, this short story, it is about the story of a hawk and how she has been identified, that a hawk has to use garland in his he a kind of notice to everyone that, this is a hawk. So rare is not possible here. The word rare will not be used here. It's an ugly word that is used in this context. So sometimes what happens that if you just translate a sentence, then there are many possibilities that you will make mistake. But if you go through the context, that in what context it has been said, then it becomes very obvious. No other possibility. At the cultural level, at the fourth, that is the cultural level. Now there is a word in Japanese. It's a proverb which says "Isshin Denshin." If you translate it, there is one word which is the kokoro. Kokoro means heart, and kokoro has one more meaning, that is the mind. Now, when you translate this Ishin Denshin, it is heart to heart communication. That means kokoro eno chokusetsu tekina communication. So this says that that the direct communication between mind to mind. Now, if in the first proverb, you will see that same kanji character kokoro, it has been translated as heart. And in the second sentence, the same kanji character, it has been translated to mind. Now, students feel difficulty, that which word has to be used. And if you see the cultural context, then in the first example, only heart will be used. No other mind cannot be replaced there. There is no possibility. Similarly, there are many such examples, and I can give you lots of examples. For example, you might have heard some Japanese words, very famous word, like they say sushi. Sushi, it's exactly translated in the English as sushi only. There's no other translation available, because what happens is sushi is a very cultural context. If you try to translate it, you can say it's a rice ball. But again, simple
seems like there's some technical issue at Mr. Ravi's end. Let's wait till we get him back. Let's wait for some time. It's back. Ravi sir, please unmute yourself. Sir, your audio is muted.
So what I was saying is, if you translate that word okonomiyaki, that is the Japanese word, into English, it will be, like you can simply translate it like pizza, that it's very famous in the Western countries. But okonomiyaki, totally, it has a Japanese nuance into it. You cannot translate it as pizza. It will be totally absurd translation. So when we are doing the translation at the cultural level, or the cultural words are involved there, we tell our students, that where there is cultural nuances are involved, you put it as it is. You put this source text in the target language as it is, because that still carries the cultural nuances into it. If you try okonomiyaki, similarly, I'll give you one more word. Like, you must have heard about samurais. Now, samurais are the warriors, the Japanese warriors. Now, what happens is, if you translate samurai as simply warriors or European warriors, or like in Hindi we say yodha, or like, so that is not the meaning when Japanese says samurais, because you need to understand that cultural context involved into it. You might have heard the word harakiri, where they cut their stomach, and this is how it's a kind of glorification of death, and that is the harakiri, and that is only used for samurais. No other person can do that harakiri. It is mainly used for the samurais. So it has a cultural context into it. Now, if I try to summarize what I'm trying to say in my presentation today, is that in Japanese language, as I told you, that in Japanese and Hindi, the sentence structure remains the same, but there are many words, even at semantic level, syntax level, context level, and at the cultural level, where it has to be very, very careful. Because if you are not paying attention, let's say you are not looking at the context or how it is going, the transition is moving in forward, then there are many chances that that you will make a mistake, and then there are lots of problems will arise while translating. So I'd like to conclude. And the last thing which I want to say, that even when I was studying in JNU, then we felt difficulty, that there is no such a dictionary which can translate from Japanese into Hindi and Hindi to vice versa. There was a dictionary, but very few need develop that huge database where students can find it very easy and look for those words in Hindi and Japanese both. Thank you so much, man. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ravi. Sorry you were lost in between.
For giving me this opportunity. I thank all the organizers, and I'm very happy to see the national workshop is going on. It's a huge. Thank you.
Pleasure is all ours, sir.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Let me thank you once again for acquiescing to our pressure and saying yes at the last moment. Since I contacted you only after upgrading the workshop to international one, so I thought there should be something to cater to international interests as well. That's why we thought we should bring these languages. And thank you so much. You are such a dear friend that you agreed at the last moment to come up with your presentation. And the takeaway of your lecture would be to avoid cultural nuances, put the text as it is. This is a great advice you've given to the budding translators. They must stick to it, because unnecessarily losing the original essence and taste of the culture would make you produce a degraded version of the original thing. So, to keep up the standards, you must stick to the original text lines, where you cannot find an equally matchable contrast to the word you actually want to use, or any replacement of the original text. If there is no such replacement, one must replicate the words. Thank you so much, Mr. Ravi.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am.
And thank you so very much, dear participants, for your patient listening and attentive participation. Now, this brings us to the end of day 3 as well. And we hope to see you all tomorrow on day 4. The schedule would be mailed to you in a similar manner as it's being done regularly. So see you all tomorrow.